Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the meeting. So we'll kick off. We've got two subs in here. I think we all know that. So taking it away, let me just bring up the agenda. Sorry, I scrolled past it quite happily. Right, so we've got apologies from, do I ask you specifically?
You can do.
All right, Callum, do we have apologies?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. We do. Apologies submitted from councillors Chris Johnson and Gregor Murray, and subbing this evening are councillors Rochelle Shepherd-Debay and Michael Firmager.
Thank you. Okay, then we have the minutes of the previous meeting. Any issues or concerns with those minutes? Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, it's just one bit. I wasn't at this meeting, but on page 11, under sort of point number 3, it says why were enforcement penalty notices more expensive in Reading compared to Reading. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. I kind of assume it's Wokingham compared to Reading, but that's only a guess. Or the other way round. Yeah, I don't know. It's just the way it kind of follows on before. That's probably what it is. But thank you.
If members want, I can do a bit more digging on that. I mean, that is absolutely correct. It shouldn't. The second one should be Wokingham and not Reading, but I can. Happy to contact the Assistant Director for Highways and get a more thorough answer.
Yeah, I kind of presume it's sort of because it's dealt with by the council that maybe Reading policy is to make it more expensive.
I know a little bit more about it. It's actually cost recovery. So it depends on how the cost is calculated. It's not meant to make a profit. So it might be that Reading's costs are higher. It might be they've calculated them differently. It'd be worth checking out.
Shirley, you had a question? Okay, thank you. Rochelle.
How much it costs in some of the other boroughs as well in Berkshire. Let's see if, and to find out why, whether they do have higher costs, or some people have higher costs than others, or what the story is.
Okay, I'll put that down as a separate question, not as an issue for the minutes. Okay, so we're just going to resolve that one issue. Any other points with the minutes? No. Do we vote to approve them?
Yeah.
Just. Any proposals for the minutes? Yeah. Al, seconder, David, and vote. Yep, that's passed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, sorry. Jumping across. Do we have any public questions?
None submitted, Chair.
Oh, sorry. Declaration of interest. No member questions? No. Okay. Moving on to the first topic, we've got Ed here to talk about the Enforcement and Safety Service update. So passing to Ed.
Yeah, good evening. My name's Ed Shaler, the head of the Enforcement and Safety Service, which is the name given to the new service from the 1st of April, which covers environmental health licensing and antisocial behaviour. And I'll say a bit more about what is included in antisocial behaviour and what that means in a few minutes. So the report in your pack starts on page 15. We were asked to provide an update on setting up this new service. We were asked some months ago to do this, bearing in mind that we're now just over 5 months into our run since the 1st of April. So I'm pleased to report that we covered the first hurdle of successfully setting up a functioning environmental health and licensing service, having taken that part of the contract with West Berkshire's Public Protection Partnership back in-house on the 1st of April. And there is a recommendation in the report that the committee pleases notes the report, but also provides feedback to officers to consider for the further development of the service, as it is still relatively early days, just within the first half year of running this new service, which we hope will run successfully for several years. Secondly, the new antisocial behaviour service, it covers a wide variety of topics, and on page 19 of the report, it lists some of the different types of activity which are covered under antisocial behaviour. You'll see that quite a lot of those are of an environmental nature. There's a very close link between behaviour which is considered antisocial, in whatever way one defines that, and environmental nuisance, whether it's noise nuisance or whether it's fly tipping or waste accumulation or any one of a number of other behaviours which would have an impact on the environment as well as on neighbours, by affecting their quality of life, which therefore makes it an environmental issue. We've given some examples there. There's sort of 8 bullet point examples from page 19 onwards. We could have listed many more. In fact, in the first draft of the report, there were many, many more, but we decided it made the report rather long, so we decided to just give 8 as examples. Some members may have seen members' briefings that I did at the beginning of May, the beginning of June, which, you know, gave several examples of work that the new antisocial behaviour team had set up. So we've got 10 posts in the antisocial behaviour team, which is, in very round figures, 7 more than we had previously. In Wokingham Council, up to the 1st of April, we had a team called the Localities Environmental Team, led by Gina Frost, the service manager, who's now the service manager for the ASB team. So a smooth transition from one team to the other with the same manager. And she effectively had 4 staff doing similar work around fly tipping, littering and environmental nuisance. But the 7 additional staff mean that we're able to tackle a lot of issues which would have been out of scope of the localities environmental team. And I think I could just summarise the difference in that when councils have very little in the way of antisocial behaviour resource, issues tend to be polarised in the sense that things reported by the public or by councillors on behalf of the public, which are, as it were, borderline crime issues. So they're sort of things that the police have powers to deal with, but they are of a relatively low threshold. Therefore, council officers could intervene. But a typical council will only have 1 or 2 officers who can do that. So they have to be very selective about what cases they take on. And then it's polarised at the other end into environmental health. In other words, is it a statutory nuisance? Yes or no? And the answer is often no, because it doesn't pass the threshold for a statutory nuisance. So you're left with a gulf in between, things which are neither a police priority because it's only borderline crime, and it's not an environmental health priority because it's not a statutory nuisance. So you end up with lots of things that the public want the council to do something about, but we don't have the capacity to do that. So when a council, and we're not the only ones to do it, but where it does happen, you put some resource into that middle ground. So we've got 7 additional officers plus an animal warden. Public Protection Partnership also provided an animal warden, so that's not new, it's just in-house. Are trying to fill that void. But there is an obvious pitfall with doing that, in that you raise an expectation that virtually every problem now has a solution, because you've got these wonderful 7 additional staff. Of course, you still have to draw the threshold as to where it is possible for the council to intervene before you become overwhelmed trying to deal with every conceivable nuisance that the public might experience, and where it is appropriate for a council to intervene. In other words, that point at which it is proportionate for the local authority to use its powers to intervene in some sort of nuisance or dispute. And there will be many cases which are below that threshold because they're effectively a private dispute between two people or a private dispute between two neighbours, and it doesn't affect anybody else. So it's not really proportionate. And then looking at it another way, there might be behaviours which, although person A might experience as being antisocial, person B thinks is perfectly normal. And if I could just give one fairly trivial example, but it is a real one, children trampolining in a garden in the summer and looking over the fence at the top of the jump, or people having a birthday party in a garden and a bit of music and it's a bit noisy. So, one person might think that's completely unreasonable, another person thinks it's perfectly normal. So you have to provide that balancing act between what would the majority view be. I did rather hastily move straight onto antisocial behaviour and sort of overlooked the environmental health aspect. So I'll just briefly touch on those, as well as licensing. So page 16 is the licensing figures. I'm pleased to say that the number of licenses we've issued is very similar to the number of applications we've received, which is, of course, as it should be. There's a bit of overlap, of course, because some applications were received before the 1st of April and others have only just been received and therefore haven't been issued yet. So the numbers don't exactly match. We've got commercial environmental health, which is food, hygiene, inspections of premises. And if there are any accidents in a workplace other than the council's own workplace, our environmental health officers will investigate. On page 18, we've got private sector housing, environmental health. This is primarily private tenants who may have a complaint against their landlord, which they've been unable to resolve. That includes mobile home parks and caravan sites. And it is possible that we could intervene with social landlords other than the council if they are the landlord and the tenants cannot get satisfaction from their normal complaints procedure. And environmental protection is largely about planning consultations for new developments. A familiar theme in this borough, of course, with new development, and they come across for an assessment of noise and other impacts from nearby commercial sites, for example. But it's also about ordinary construction site noise and dust from construction sites. So I won't speak any longer. I'll open it up for any questions or comments you may have.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just go around that way. So Laura?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you so much for that presentation. Are there any figures from before it was brought in-house when it comes to antisocial behaviour? So we can actually do a comparison of the number of cases, but also anything else that is measured, like satisfaction or response times? Is there any plan to capture satisfaction?
Thank you. It's probably put the microphone on because it won't be recording, I think. I had pretty much the same question as Laura, but maybe just to take that further. I'm assuming because there are more staff now, we probably are dealing with more issues. So therefore, we've put the hurdle in a slightly different place. Are we finding that all our people are fully engaged and could take on more, or is it just about right? I mean, what's the feeling about number of issues and ability to deal with them?
Yes, about the volumes. We're certainly, the officers have been very busy, especially during the summer period. It's generally a busy period for this kind of report. Private sector housing, the reports tend to be higher in the winter when it's cold and damp and people experience problems in their properties. But nuisance type issues tend to be more in the summer when windows are open and people are out and there's more daylight. We are dealing with more because we are not putting the shutters up with regards to, is it crime, go to the police, or is it statutory nuisance, we'll deal with it. We're dealing with a lot of stuff in between. It's almost like a sliding scale because the staff that you've got can easily fill their time answering more and more service requests. If they get pushed for time or they're short of numbers, then they can be more selective about which cases they take on. But having said that, of course, we need to be consistent throughout the year. We can't just take on a case sometimes because we've got time and other times not because we can't. We're trying to be consistent about when it's appropriate for us to intervene. And the deciding factor is there an impact on the wider community or a vulnerable person, for example? So if it's a neighbour reporting a nuisance against another neighbour, it doesn't really appear to be affecting anybody else, but that person has a vulnerability. I don't particularly want to generalise as to what that vulnerability is, but obviously there are a number of reasons why somebody might have limited resources, shall we say, to deal with it themselves, that we would take that case on.
Yeah, I think, that's where it starts to get a little bit fuzzy sometimes, because I've known in the past council officers being helpful to people where it is a neighbour dispute, which strictly speaking we shouldn't be involved in, but then, you know, sort of disengaging partway through, and that leads to sort of disappointment. So I think, you know, if we engage, we need to see it through. Otherwise, it's a neighbour dispute and not to touch it. So I think that's certainly a lesson I've seen in the past.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions for Ed and then one for Neil, if that's possible. So the first question was, of the number of ASB teams, ASB reports you've had, what percentage do you think are actually valid, roughly?
Valid reports. That's a good question. I couldn't give you a precise figure. It would be something of a guess, but suffice to say that officers will often be heard to tell me about cases they've received which they didn't think were appropriate. And I wouldn't want to trivialise it by giving examples, but I mentioned that one earlier about children playing or something like that. You know, noise from a school playground at break time, noise from you know, school orchestra practice or something like that, which they think actually this is not something the council should be intervening with in the sense that it's antisocial behaviour. Yes, I wouldn't want to put a guess on the figure, but there certainly are several where you might think that it's actually not proportionate for the council to be involved here. And I think Councillor Jorgensen's point is very well made, and I agree completely. If you sort of go down a misguided path of trying to be helpful and giving the impression that you're going to take it on rather than just give advice, that's a dangerous path because people feel let down if they thought you were going to do it. It is a difficult one to resolve because obviously we do want to sometimes give people advice. So we can advise how they could deal with something, but they might hear it that we're going to do it. So the communication being clear is very important so that people don't think that we're going to do it for them.
So just to push you a little bit, do you think more than half are valid or less than half?
I think more than half are valid.
Okay.
If I'll take up a tiny bit of time just to say why, because I think we're trying to be that filling the void in between crime and statutory nuisance, because I think that's what we were asked to do. You know, as it says in the first paragraph of the report, the idea is to provide an effective response to the problems that people are experiencing, including on Saturdays and Sundays, hence the 7-day week rota.
Thanks. So the second question was really right at the start of this. The two things that we thought you could really help with were car meets and also potentially complaints about drugs and that sort of stuff. I'm just wondering if you've had an effect there and whether you're able to do both and whether it's been successful.
The car meets one, our officers have been to car meets with the police. I believe there haven't been a particularly large number over the summer since April. They may have been occurring in other boroughs. We've got the Public Spaces Protection Order coming to executive on the 29th of September, which will give powers to our officers to warn people with their power to issue a fixed penalty notice for certain driving behaviours and also spectating, as it were, aiding and abetting behaviours. So we need to do that jointly with the police because of risk issues if they arise. But the fixed penalty notice power will be used based on registration plate details. So we're not going to be asking our officers to confront drivers in a dangerous situation, bearing in mind our complete lack of backup compared to a police officer. But the register keeper details will be enough for us to progress a fixed penalty notice intervention. I think the other point you asked was about drugs.
Yeah.
Did you mean drug dealing or,
Yes.
or drug use?
Yeah.
Primarily a police power, so not so much for us to deal with. There might be an occasion, depending on the tenancy tenure, that council officers could be involved because of breach of tenancy issues. But if it was street-based drug dealing, that will be one for the police to deal with. It would be too dangerous for our officers to try to intervene, and they don't have arrest powers or search powers, so there wouldn't really be any benefit. Where it's residential, there are potential statutory nuisance opportunities.
It was residential I was thinking of, not street-based.
Yeah, it depends on the tenure. I mean, if they're social housing tenants or council tenants, we would liaise with the housing provider. Council housing obviously is in-house because that would be a breach of tenancy agreement, which may provide some leverage. It'd be behaviour, I can't remember the exact wording, but it would be behaviour, criminal activity. That would be the one. I'm sure there will be a standard clause in the council's tenancy agreements not to use the premises for any illegal activity.
That's useful.
And likewise, visitors and family members would also be caught. The tenants would be caught by visitors and family members doing the same thing.
Okay, that's very useful to know. And I think the final question for Neil was, who's the exec member for this?
Ian Chenton.
Was he invited?
Yeah, I believe he's on leave.
Okay, because I mean, the terms of reference to this says this is to ask the exec member for questions, and it would be nice if we scheduled it when the exec member could actually be here. I think so. Thanks to you for coming, but actually, it's not really the point. You're meant to be the backup, not the main person. Thank you.
I know he's on holiday. I spoke to him last week. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, we're kind of following on from Laura and Norman's points, really. I just sort of wondered about staff levels. Are they adequate at the moment? That's one question. Perhaps I could be yes or no, but and also following on from that as well about the recruitment process. I was just wondering, did you find it work well, and what about it working in the future as well? Are you comfortable with that?
Our recruitment processes at the council. Is that the question?
Specifically to do with the licensing coming back to the borough.
Yes.
I just wonder what I'm just really asking you the questions. I'm hoping you can give me an answer, really.
I've just clarifying the question. Is it about, were we able to recruit staff? Was that your?
No, I'm just really wondering, are you finding, did the work with the process itself, did it work well? Did it work badly? Did you get the right people that you want? And also going on for the future, you probably use that model going on for future years as well, because obviously people are going to retire, people are going to leave, might well be expanded as well. So that's really the levels about that as well. I mean, I think you may mention it's a bit difficult maybe to measure some of it until we've gone through this for a good sort of probably a year. So I just really wonder what your view is on that.
The process of setting the new service up and transitioning from public protection partnership, I think worked extremely well. The council has a transformation service, business redesign. They put project managers on this. When I started last November, following a recruitment to my post, I was very pleased to see there were 6 project work streams, each with a project lead, accommodation, IT, legal, processes, communication, and another one. And it was very well organised and it was very well staffed. And there was quite a lot of resources were put into, for example, hiring a specific HR lead, that was the other one, HR, to progress the TUPE transfers of staff from West Berkshire and to assist with the recruitment process. So I think it was well resourced and it was completed successfully, largely because it was very well organised.
Yeah, so you're kind of getting the right staff that you need.
Yes. So moving on to the staffing, we got 7 staff from West Berkshire, and another one who, after we'd started, contacted us and said she'd like to come and work part-time on an as and when needed. So we've actually got 8 of staff from West Berkshire. We interviewed them all and we didn't accept everybody who applied from West Berkshire to come, not because they were poor quality people, but because they were applying for roles which were different from what they were doing before and they weren't really suitable for that particular role, or they were applying for a promoted role and they may not have met the bar for the promoted role. But we were very pleased with the 8 staff that we got from West Berkshire, and all the other staff we've recruited are very good. If I could summarise it, recruitment is challenging because there are not enough people around applying for environmental health and licensing jobs to fill all the posts in all the councils across the whole country. Bearing in mind, every unitary and second tier authority, borough and district council like Surrey, have all got licensing and environmental health departments. So they're all competing for the same staff. So the ones we've got, we had quality rather than quantity. So we didn't have massive shortlists, which did make life easier because we didn't have to spend quite so much time interviewing when you've only got 2 or 3 people to interview. But obviously you're very much on the cusp that you will find people who are suitable for your job and that they will accept the role, bearing in mind salary levels and competition from other boroughs. So yes, we got very good people, we got very good quality, but we weren't inundated with applications at any point. The antisocial behaviour team, we've had some turnover already, perhaps not completely surprising because it's a 7-day week shift rota. It's not an unpleasant shift rota. They certainly don't have to work every weekend or even every other weekend. But some people tried it thinking that they wouldn't mind working till 2 a.m. Friday and Saturday night, but after a while realised they actually didn't like it, so they've moved on. And then we recruit more people, and we've got 2 interviews this week. So going into October, if we fill the 2 posts we're interviewing for this week, we'll have 8 of the 10 posts filled, plus the animal board. So we're running slightly under capacity, but budget-wise, that's probably not a bad thing because it'll make it easier to balance our budget in year 1.
There's just another question which is just sort of picked on something you said before, that you wouldn't want to put the staff in danger because they do not have the backup like the police do. But I was kind of wondering, what sort of backup do council officers have if they might find themselves in a position of danger? Would they have access to the police then for protection and everything else to make sure they don't come to harm and members of the public as well don't come to harm.
Yes, I mean, our officers, not unlike officers in other parts of the council, perhaps, but perhaps more of a percentage are in environmental health or antisocial behaviour, where they're typically working on their own. In environmental health, they always work on their own, unless they think that a situation it might be hostile, like visiting a house in multiple occupation where they're investigating potential unlicensed or other breaches of regulations, and that the tenants may not welcome them, let alone the landlord. Then they'll go to two people and obviously take precautions, and they won't enter if they think it's too risky, like a drug den or something. They just won't go in. Antisocial behaviour, they will often work in pairs. They can work in pairs. Weekends and evenings, they tend to be in pairs because there's less of us around at the office. But they will spend a lot of time visiting sites on their own. Fortunately, a lot of the things that were reported, and I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we do is environmental type nuisance or offences. So there's a pretty low risk of an offender either being present when you arrive or hostile in any serious way. However, there are some situations where the people we're visiting might be very hostile. Our officers will comply with a version of the lone working safety procedure, which mainly involves making sure people know where they are and where they've gone, their expected return time, so that if they don't return, the cavalry can be alerted, which basically is the police. Well, first of all us, but if we think someone's in danger, we'll call the police. Officers can call 999 from the field. We also have a app-based product called People Safe, which corporate health and safety have procured. So we've all got it available. So it runs on our smartphones as an app. So if you switch it on before you go out on your visit, it will follow your location, GIS mapping. There's a button on it to call for SOS help. But even better, if you press the power button a number of times, it will do the same thing. I've had to increase my number of presses to 8 because I was constantly being phoned up by People Safe saying, "Are you all right?" Yeah, I've increased it to 8. But yes, if you want to just do it in your pocket, you can press the button 8 times, and then it will switch to record, and the operators will be able to hear what's going on, what the phone can hear, and if they assess that there's raised voices or whatever else that they can hear, they might call the police and send them to the location. So the police backup is there. I've answered it at some length because it is something that concerns us quite a lot. I mean, I have sometimes been heard to say we have no taser, no handcuffs, no pepper spray, no stab vest, and we have no radios, and we have no army. So our officers do have to be very careful in assessing where they go and how they do it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think we all share the safety of the officers concerned, and we don't wish them to come to any harm during their job.
Hi, thank you. And just start by echoing points made by Laura and by Norman earlier on about measuring satisfaction of the service from a resident's point of view. And I'm glad you've sort of taken note of that. I've one sort of more general question than a couple of specific ones. From a general point of view, the information you've given us so far is pretty impressive, and it looks like you're making real progress. What are the challenges that you feel are still out there, the challenges that you've yet to meet? You know, if you had double the resources, which I'm sure you won't get, but were you to get them, what would you do with them?
Yeah, double the resources. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? The volume cases which we sometimes have to be selective where we take them on. So I think that's probably the best way of answering it. Which are the cases where if we had, shall we say, unlimited resources, could we do more? So you're probably looking at pest and vermin infestations or reports of rats and mice or other types of pests even, where we are advising the residents that if they need a pest control company, they should source one privately, a commercial pest company. I'm not saying that's wrong. I mean, that's a perfectly normal way to do things. But of course, quite often they'll say, but I don't know where the pests are coming from. I've had pest control before and they've cost me a lot of money and I've still got them. Or they might be a housing association tenant or a private tenant with an uncooperative landlord. So that's just sort of example of one which is high volume and difficult to deal with constrained resources. And I think it is one that bothers the public quite a lot. Fly tipping, of course, happens a lot in Woking Borough, as it does in many places. And we will go to site and try and find evidence. There's an awful lot of fly tipping where you just look at the pictures and you think, well, it's very unlikely there's any evidence there. We'll just arrange for a clearance. And of course, it costs the council a fortune to clear fly tips from public land or laybys or highways. So I'm not saying you would necessarily catch more people, because if it's something like a fridge or a sofa, it's impossible that there would be any identifying name and address attached to it. If it's cardboard packaging, then of course we could go straight there, because you just hope that one of these boxes they've forgotten to take the address label off, so you know whose packaging it was. So fly tipping and pests and vermin are a high volume issues. Animal warden service, we have one animal warden who is very, very good. She's got, would you believe, a degree in canine psychology. I wasn't aware there was one, but she has it. She's a dog lover and knows lots and lots about just about every animal. But of course, we can't be chasing around parks and byways trying to catch a stray dog. Even with good dog skills, you'd be out there for hours before the dog gets so tired that you can round them up. So we ask the public to, if the dog is tethered or secured, that we will come and collect, or we will send a contractor to come and collect. It's often cheaper to send Noah's Ark, the contractor, to collect the stray dog, but it has to be secured. You know, they won't spend all day trying to entice a stray. So strays, pest nuisance and fly tipping are high volume, and if you had more, you could probably do more.
Thank you. One specific sort of follow-up on that. I noticed under your environmental health comments that you've done 116 food premises inspections. That's something, by my dodgy maths, to be about 10% of the total. Do you have a kind of a regular cycle for that, or is it targeted, or how do you go about allocating those inspections?
Yeah, it was in the original draft of the report, actually, but it hit the cut. So they're graded from A to E. You're probably familiar with the scores on the doors, the food hygiene rating 1 to 5, or 0 to 5, I should say. Everybody wants a 5. And the ones which are graded 0, 1 or 2 get an inspection every 6 months. 3's an inspection every 12 months, and 4's and 5's 18 months. There are some that those are 18 months, or they might even be deemed so low risk that they are just done on a questionnaire basis. When I say low risk, I mean either they are so well run that they don't need regular inspections, like, or they are selling pre-packaged food that never sees the light of day outside of its wrappers. Therefore, it's so low risk that it's just canned food, basically, or a food shop. So yes, they are prioritised according to the risk rating, or if they are unrated. So new businesses, of course, are unrated until they've been inspected. So we prioritise those. So 116 was over 4 months. So you might triple that for the number per year. So you might get to about 350 per year, which is 30% of the total.
Thank you for that. And finally, I know that the Public Protection Partnership is responsible for air quality monitoring. And you may not be able to answer what I'm about to ask, but I'm struck by the number of times that air quality comes up as an issue in planning issues. An area, a planning application goes through without somebody protesting about it in terms of impact on air quality. I feel it'd be useful if we had some sort of data which gave us a scale of this. I'm sure there are hotspots across the borough. I know of one or two, but not all of them. And it would give many of us, particularly on the planning committee, some sort of guidance that you could see that wherever a planning application came up, it was either well below a threshold or it was close to it. I don't know whether there's anything you can comment on about that, but certainly that is an area where I feel we're asked to sort of comment upon and are particularly equipped to do so.
Yes, it's come within our remit at the council. We commission PPP to do the air quality monitoring, so they do the tubes and the sampling, and they collect them every month and send them off for analysis. And there are some routine monitoring sites like the one in Peach Street. Can't think of a shop that is nearby. Millets, is it the camping shop? It's about halfway down. There's a ugly grey box on the pavement, which is an air quality monitoring station. There are air quality management areas: Wokingham Town Centre, Twyford Town Centre, and the M4 corridor. The M4 corridor is mostly down to the Highways Agency, and not surprisingly, they tell us that the smart motorway has solved it. But obviously, you can monitor the emissions along that corridor. It is in scope for removing the air quality management area. So the M4 corridor is not a massive concern. Whether you get much house building applications along there, I suppose I doubt. So it's probably more to do with Twyford and Wokingham.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes, of course.
Just say the microphone.
Because there's two on, you're one, yeah.
Just to say that the management committee has an item on its forward programme on air quality, so you may want to feed into that review, councillor, as we get towards it in the next couple of months, and then we can liaise with Ed about the appropriate areas to consider and questions.
Yeah, so it sounds like I'll be back to do that. But there are 14 schools that are getting some monitoring, which has just started with monitoring devices being put onto lampposts near schools. So the short answer is yes, there is some data around, and with some notice I could produce some sort of comparative data about how that relates. But I wanted to sort of highlight the locations in the borough which have got the poorer air quality, which is not surprising. It's where the traffic accumulates. It's nearly all traffic related in Wokingham because there's so little industry. And of course, our old friends, the level crossings, because the barriers are down for such a long time, you get queuing traffic for anything up to 3-4 minutes. And if we could persuade drivers to switch their engines off, it would improve the air quality in those areas. Although it's not desperately bad, because the houses are set well back from the road, or perhaps there aren't any houses. But the town centres, of course, you've got high-sided buildings, which traps the poor air.
Just quickly, how did you select the 14 schools out of interest?
I'd have to go and ask. I'm afraid it was before I started that they were selected. I will no doubt that will come forward in the air quality item.
Shirley.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Ed. I've got a few questions. First one is going back to identifiable fly tipping. I've got a resident who is he's really ace at finding fly tipping. I don't know how he does it, but he's always finding it, and quite often identifiable fly tipping, which he reports. He used to send to me, but I've got him reporting it himself now, which is great. But he made the point the other day is that he never hears back. He hears back to say, thank you for reporting a fly tipping, it's been dealt with. But it would be very nice to receive feedback, and I think he's right, on whether it led to a prosecution, whether that person was fined or whatever the actual process, what happened to it, and I think that, that would encourage more people. And I think probably we as councillors would also like to know whether something we'd reported had led to somebody being fined. There'd be a certain satisfaction that was a job well done kind of thing. So that was the first observation. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
No, I agree completely. It's partly a capacity issue because officers so quickly are moving on to the next case that by the time they've resolved a case, they're sort of almost mentally sort of moved on to the next thing. So, I don't think it is really in total a capacity issue because it's partly about training and development and an attitude of mind of the officers to remember that if they've completed a case and they're about to wrap it up and go and do something else, to actually remember to see if there was somebody who would like to know what happened. So I think there is a training and development and coaching issue for our staff for them to remember to do that. They're fairly focused on getting a result in the particular case, and it would be nice for them to go for that sort of extra step to think about informing people what happened.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think that would be really, really useful. Second point is you mentioned car meets briefly and said that there hadn't been too many. I beg to differ in regards to the Thames Valley Park and Ride and the Thames Valley Park Drive, where, as far as I can gather, they're happening with alarming regularity. And I think probably the reason that you don't hear from them is that it's not a residential area. In fact, I only have one resident who lives in that area who apparently has complained to the police, and his take is that they don't do anything. They're not interested because it's not a residential area. And I've now said to him, don't phone the police, to contact the ASV team instead. So which I'm hoping he is doing. But I mean, we do have a business there. We have Wokingham Waterside Centre, which I'm an interest in. And it's ruined part of their business, which was a camping field at the back of the centre. They can no longer have groups camping there because of this promotion that's going on until the early hours of the morning. So, you know, there is an issue there. And I don't know whether you can get figures from the police as to how many times it's been reported over the summer, but I think that would give an indication that there is a problem there.
No, I certainly recall the messaging about that site. We did put a request over to the police for a comment about prioritisation of that type of area. And it is a question of resourcing and priorities, really. But the point was accepted, you know, that there is regular sort of drag racing or, you know, screeching tyres around the roundabouts there.
Absolutely, it's terrifying.
Picking up one of the earlier questions about proportionality and what would you do if you had unlimited resources, which of course we don't have unlimited resources, that it is fairly regular sort of decision to make, that where you've got more people experiencing the nuisance and more people reporting, it is likely to get more attention, obviously because you've got more people reporting, so there's a bigger voice. But equally importantly, it's how many people is it affecting, and the more people it affects, the more serious it is. But that's not to say that sometimes there isn't the situation that might only be affecting one person, and that person's life is being made such a misery that actually they do need some help from the council, as I was saying earlier, about people who've got limited capacity or resources to actually deal with it themselves. You know, not everybody's able to go off and hire a lawyer and take their own legal action against people. They might need some help from the council, and that's a judgment call. And you've got a business being affected there as well.
Yeah, indeed. And you know, if they're hurtling around the car park, you know, doing donuts and figures of 8 and things like that, I mean, they are damaging the surface. So I just wonder what would be the next stage if this landlord doesn't do what he's supposed to do? What then is the next process on down the line?
Yes, the process is relatively straightforward. You know, just depending on the capacity of the officer to actually get the work done. We will ask landlord. We will tell landlords. Let's make the assumption it's not an emergency or a hazard which is so serious to life and health that it needs to be tackled immediately. So the average type problem, the landlord will be advised that they need to make certain repairs, and they'll be given a timescale to do it, or they'll be asked to tell us what timescale they can do it, when can they get a contractor, when can they get the work done. If that seems reasonable, we'll let them do it. And if they don't, we can use one of the many powers in the Housing Act 2004. So typically an improvement notice, which specifies what the hazards are, and what remedial action the landlord is required to do and within what timescale. And failure to comply with an improvement notice is an offence triable in the magistrates' court, and it could lead to a banning order and all sorts of other unpleasant consequences for landlords, like a rent repayment order, which you may have heard of, where tenants can claim rent back because a landlord has failed to comply. So there's lots of leverage we can apply to landlords, which usually makes them carry out the repairs without waiting for an improvement notice.
This particular landlord has decided that he can't afford the repairs, so he's put the property up for sale with my resident as a sitting tenant. And of course, nobody wants to buy it with a sitting tenant and with a, so we kind of seem to have reached some sort of impasse with it. So clearly,
yeah. I mean,
needs to be done.
I described what hopefully sounds like a fairly straightforward process, but of course, reality of life, each case has to be looked at on its merits, and landlords sometimes have financial challenges just as tenants do. So we'd have to look at the case on its merits and effectively see whether the landlord's excuse is a reasonable one. Most offences in law have the defence of reasonable excuse. So if the landlord is genuinely broke, then the tenant may have to be a little bit patient to get the repairs done. But if they're paying rent, they're still entitled to enjoyment of the property free of health hazards.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. And one final one, if I may. When the service came back in house, when we had a briefing, all the councillors had a briefing about that, and I think we were told that this was kind of the first stage of bringing things back into house. Is that right? So are other services going to eventually come back in house, or are we going to have this hybrid service going forward? And one of the things I particularly remember that members were in favour of, and they particularly liked, one of the few things that they particularly liked about the old shared service was the website. The website for the public protection organisation was brilliant. It was really easy to use. It was you know, people engaged with it very easily, much more than they probably do. So I just wondered whether there were any thoughts on having a separate website, and also whether any other services are likely to come in.
Yes,
come back.
I think I'll answer the last point first because it's the easier answer. I believe Wokingham is going to get a new website in the next 12 to 18 months. So yes, is the short answer. There will be an improvement to the website. I don't think we'll have any specific website outside the council's framework because there's no particular reason to, because we're part of Wokingham Council now. So it will sit within the council's normal pages. The current pages, and I won't go on too long about it because it could talk for hours, they're a little challenging because the services that are contained in this report appear in about 4 or 5 different places on the website. And you kind of have to make an educated guess which bit of the website you go to. So business and licensing, for example, will eventually lead you to the food hygiene. Yeah, but you might not think of that when you're looking for food hygiene. You can, of course, use the search function, which is what I would always recommend because people could navigate around the entire website before they find what they're looking for. So the search function would be the place to start. But there is a new website coming. The start of a 10 model. If I could reprise what our director, I could probably say it because I heard him say it a number of times. He would say, in the first year, don't expect us to get everything right first time. You know, give us a benefit of the sort of 80-20 rule. We'll get 80% of it right and 20% we'll learn as we go along. That's what Steve Moore said a number of times in the preamble. So, and I think that's what he meant by this was the first start, because we're not planning to bring any more services back from the Public Protection Partnership. They provide the trading standards service for the 3 boroughs, and they're a very good trading standards provider. They get lots of prosecutions of rogue traders and other consumer protection breaches. And in a 2-tier authority like Surrey, of course, trading standards is provided at the county level, not the borough level. So there's a kind of logic to trading standards when you're dealing with some quite complicated corporate consumer protection crimes sometimes. The air quality monitoring, which we've mentioned, and their legal service, who are very good at helping build cases to go to court. And that's how we envisage it will probably remain. It's a 5-year agreement with West Berks, initially for a 2-year period, then to be reviewed.
Sure.
Several questions. First of all, you talked about noise nuisance cases.
Hmm.
Do you go out with any kind of meter to read the decibels that they're putting out, or even an app on the phone that can do that, so you can have some proof about whether it's a problem or not?
No, we are relying on the objective assessment test. So we will ask our officers to go to the complainant's property. This is for an alleged statutory nuisance case. There are other ways of dealing with noise nuisance that don't involve such interventions. But to do a statutory nuisance test, we'll go to the complainant's property and listen to the noise whilst it's occurring. And if it is sufficiently loud that you think, well, I couldn't sleep, or I couldn't sit here and read a book because I couldn't concentrate, or if I was watching TV, I wouldn't be able to hear it without turning the volume up unbearably loud. Those are the 3 basic tests for a domestic noise nuisance case. And because the model we're using is we've got officers available, not 24 hours, of course, but across the 7 days. So as much as possible, we will try to go to site whilst the noise is on, either because somebody has phoned in and said, there's an absolute racket going on, can you come? I'll say, well, actually we can't, because we're not finished shift for another 3 hours, so we're off. Or because it's like pre-planned. So a commercial site, for example, which appears to make considerable amounts of noise at random times, we will ask the complainants to call us when it's happening, or when the noise is on, as the jargon goes, and then we will try and get there within 5 or 10 minutes if it's quite close. If it's a bit further, it might take a bit longer, and then hear it for ourselves. There are occasions when you can use noise recorders and decibel meters more around commercial type premises. So commercial premises will have environmental permits which may have decibel limits on the amount of noise they can emit, which may need to be monitored and measured. We've got some sites in the borough that are like that, the commercial sites. The apps on the phones are more for the customers to use. We haven't yet gone down the road of the noise app, because it's what it's called, the noise app. It's a commercial product, because they're not always evidentially viable in court. And it raises an expectation in the customer that they're being asked to do yet another thing, namely record every time the noise comes on, send it in over an email with a audible file attachment. Obviously raises the expectation that something wonderful is going to happen, and then they get even more disappointed when it doesn't happen. Similarly, we try not to encourage people to fill in endless diary sheets to tell us when the noise is happening, if nothing happens as a result. So the model is to try and go to site and hear it whilst it's happening, and then either go and knock on the door of the source address, or consider some other written response.
On the animal warden referrals, you talked about stray dogs and other stray, out of hours strays. What do you do with the dogs that you find? Do you scan them for their chip? And if not, what do you do with the dogs? Do they go to a rescue or something? I've had rescue dogs for many years. That's why I'm asking. Or do you just put them back out on the street? You know, that kind of thing.
No, they go to kennels and they check for a microchip, so they can contact the owner. If there's no microchip, they'll keep the dog for a period of time to see if it's claimed. Effectively, if someone has lost a dog, you would expect them to contact either animal charities or a nearby council, or even just social media, to see where their dog is, and eventually they may find the dog at a rescue centre. The rescue centres will, sorry, I'm not an expert on this, but they will, publish the animals that they've got that they are hoping to reunite with their owners. So it's really up to the owner, if they lose a dog, to do whatever research they can to try and find their dog.
Useful
if it's not microchipped.
Give them to a rescue centre if you can't. Otherwise, you don't have any place to keep them, really.
Well, they're in kennels, and once the
Yeah.
period is expired for the owner to collect, they'll go to rescue centres.
Okay.
For
What,
rehoming.
any other animals you have other than dogs you found? I remember seeing a picture on South Today with a python coming through from a house
Yeah.
to a house.
Yeah, obviously, there's lots of animals and there's reptiles as well. We have an arrangement with the City of London. I'm afraid it does escape me why the City of London have got involved in animal welfare. It's not your first automatic assumption, is it,
There's a
that
lot of animals.
the square mile would be doing animal welfare for the whole of the south of England, but they do. It may be a commercial venture, but they are very good. They've got animal experts and even some vets on their payroll. So if we had an exotic animal, and the Heathrow reception centre for exotic animals is apparently also run by the City of London. So they've pretty much got it cleaned up.
Okay. Last question is about bonfires.
Mm.
Do you also notify the Royal Berks Fire and Rescue Service about bonfires, so they can at least find out where these people are coming, doing things, and they can come out and talk to them? I wear this as my hat, my other hat of being the vice chair of the fire authority, and there's a problem right now, especially with bonfires or barbecues.
Oh, you mean because of the dry grass and the summer wildfire issue? Yeah. Yes, you were thinking of the summer, the hot weather, the risk of bushfires. Yes, the short answer obviously is a joint concern.
You just mentioned you go to the police and, but you don't talk about the fire service as well.
No, didn't make it into this particular report, but obviously with housing issues, there are lots of times we liaise with fire around housing, fire safety.
Okay.
Bonfires, bushfires, yes. I mean, the fire brigade, you will know this in your role, we're on high alert in the summer for bushfires. There were concerns reported about fire setting. I mean, controlled bonfires and trade fires, although they might be undesirable for smoke reasons, they may not have been a high risk for bushfires, but we did have some reports for barbecues or impromptu fire setting. Obviously, arson is always a concern, that people might stupidly, deliberately set fires. Our officers, I think from memory, did have one or two that they were notified about, and yes, they would liaise with fire and rescue.
Al, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, I've just got one question. I was just quite interested in workplace injuries and accidents. Is that mainly building sites, or is this all randomly across all sorts of offices and agriculture or whatever?
I would suspect, in the nature of the borough, with very few factories, it's more likely to be a building sites. And sorry, what was the other example you gave?
Agriculture.
Yeah, agricultural machinery, that kind of thing. So yes, it would be a workplace. Offices you mentioned, didn't you? Yes. Well, of course, there could be an accident in an office. You would hope not, being such a controlled environment, but it can still happen. You know, windows unsecured or falls downstairs or something like that. But the more likely occasion for a workplace accident would probably be building site or agriculture. So it's quite a complicated arrangement where the health and safety executive investigates certain types of accidents and local authorities everything else. In its simplest terms, the HSE do the serious stuff. So a death in a workplace would go straight to the HSE, and there are certain types of workplace, such as chemical involvement or asbestos removal, which would go to the HSE. And when I say asbestos removal, I mean actual asbestos removal, like from the building, not taking the roof off a garage, which is a frequent source of confusion to just about everybody. They see their neighbour taking the asbestos corrugated sheet off their garage and get very worried that this is a breach of all the regulations. But there's actually no reason why you can't take the roof off a garage as long as you don't break it up. But anyway, I digress. But there are certain things of the serious end that go to the HSE. The local authority would be where an injury has been caused, but not a life-threatening injury. or a broken leg, broken arm, a trapped finger, something like that. Local authority will investigate. Yeah.
So these figures are just the ones that the local authority use?
Oh, yes. I haven't included anything to do with the HSE. I mean, a lot of these are inquiries. They're not necessarily accidents. Can't remember what the exact number was, but the majority of them will be inquiries. Workplace health and safety service requests. So I don't think there have been 10 serious injuries, but there might have been a couple of reasonably serious injuries and 8 inquiries about, I'm a bit worried about my workplace. You know, I think it's an accident waiting to happen. So that nature.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thanks for the answers. I've got some questions myself. One of them is following on from David's about challenges. So you sort of talked around actually getting more staff to deal with issues, but with the staffing levels that you have now, what difficulties have you faced in order to deal with casework? Is there something that could be thought about there? There's something that could be done better, as it were?
It's a slightly intangible one, which is somehow managing to manage expectations without giving out a message, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. You know, I encourage my staff never to say, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. If they need to say something, I say, well, there might be something we can do. It'll depend on the circumstances. So, because local authorities have many powers, so nearly everything that people report, in theory, we could do something about it. So the argument, I'm sorry, with nothing we can do, is sometimes a slight misleading, because what you actually mean is there is something we could do, but we don't have enough resources to actually prioritise it. So what would help, and it would help the public too, if they had a clearer idea of what it is proportionate for the local authority to deal with and what isn't. It's not an easy answer, not least because people have different opinions. You know, some people think local authorities should be clamping down on certain things or perhaps lots of things. Other people think that local authorities should back off and just let people be and only deal with serious things.
Because more going along the lines of, what do you find frustrating that prevents you doing something that you think that you could be doing?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've necessarily thought of anything along those lines. If I think of the service as a whole, if I may, rather than just the ASB team, because I generally think the ASB team has actually got quite a good balance. We've got 10 posts and we've got 8 posts filled. That's probably enough to do quite a lot of useful work in the community. And if you just added more and more staff, you wouldn't necessarily get the same return. At the end of the day, there are only so many emails and so many phone calls from the public for us to answer. And as I said earlier, there's no point going out to deal with something just because you can, if you're just going to create confusion about where our remit begins and ends. But in the 2 strands of environmental health, particularly the housing one, which is housing, mobile home parks, caravan sites, also environmental protection, so pollution, planning consultations, statutory noise. We have 3.6 officers and a manager. The one of those 3 posts we've just managed to fill with a contractor from an agency, because we weren't able to recruit to the posts twice with sufficient calibre of person to justify filling that post. We could have filled the post quite easily with a much more junior person and embarked on a training up exercise. And that may be what we think about doing in future, is effectively training our own environmental health officers from a more junior starting point. You get the benefit of their enthusiasm and keenness of being new, but you lose because they don't have a wealth of knowledge and expertise built up over years. But if you start doing that, eventually you start to reap the rewards, of course. But there's probably more we could do in the housing sector if we had more capacity.
Thank you. With regard to customer relationship management, I think a few of us have said about feedback loop back to the residents, is do we have a CRM, and when you close down a call or a ticket, whatever, could that be send an automated response to the resident saying it's been fixed? Are you happy with the service? I know my workplace do that.
Yes, the the phone calls, it's built into the system. The system's called NetCall. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's this highly computerized. They don't answer the telephone anymore. It's all done through the computer, and it logs the call and how long the call took, and as a satisfaction level that the customer officer fills in at the end. Email, they get an automated reply with an option to select good, bad or ugly from the service that they received. So that's customer feedback. There are other ways of doing it, of course. We've encouraged members of the public to contact us by email because we're still working on an online reporting tool, which we hope will come on stream in the next month or so. But email has actually worked pretty well. You know, we accept that there are some people who don't have email and don't want to have email, so they still need to ring us up. But there's lots of people actually quite happy to, if they're said email ASB@Wokingham, then that's exactly what they do. And then the officers can reply and the conversation can happen without having all the frustration of leaving messages on people's voicemails, getting a phone call when you're driving. All of that sort of disappears when you're communicating by email. That generally works quite well. So we could send surveys out to people by email using their contact details that we've got recorded. How much of a response you would get is open to question. People who are satisfied, unfortunately, tend not to be so motivated to reply. People who are still aggrieved probably would be. But that's not a bad thing because you find out why people were aggrieved. It could be a learning piece. So.
My final question is about holiday periods. I know we've got Halloween, we've got 5th November coming up. We've obviously going to have fireworks parties going on at that time. Do you do any sort of specific staffing for those levels?
We haven't done over the summer and the holidays that we had. We made sure that we had officers working the 4-day Jubilee weekend and the 4-day Easter weekend. So we covered all those shifts. We would probably cover the Halloween and the fireworks night shifts in the same way, especially the weekends. I mean, we've got cover at the weekends anyway. I know the police often put quite a lot of communications and resourcing around Halloween because of trick or treating and that kind of thing, and nuisance fireworks, people letting them off. And given the time of year that's not far away, it's more than likely that Gina Frost would be talking to our police colleagues to say, would you like to do anything jointly around those times? Fireworks are a nuisance in two ways. A, because they're a nuisance, and B, because they go bang and then you don't hear them anymore. So trying to find out where a firework came from or who let it off is extremely difficult. Yeah, the police enforce the Fireworks Act, which is the 11 o'clock cut-off for fireworks, except for November the 5th, New Year's Eve and Diwali, when it's a bit later. What we say to people is who may have had a nuisance firework party in their neighbourhoods to tell us where the event took place, because we could take some retrospective action. I mean, it's not that we want to, because the average fireworks party is just that. But occasionally you get nuisance fireworks parties where it's probably a neighbour's dispute going on and they do it on purpose, or they know that the neighbours have got pets who hate fireworks and they do it anyway. I mean, that becomes borderline antisocial, doesn't it? But it comes back to that point I made earlier. Where would the average person think that the local authority's duties lie? You know, are we the party police, or, you know, are we here to actually stop people doing things which are deliberately upsetting their neighbours? Or should we be letting people do what they're allowed to do under the law? So you just got to draw that line somewhere.
Cool. Thank you.
Made me think of one more area, actually. I think I've got 3 cases at the moment where people have got nuisance from houses that are unoccupied, that are in the same, but that generally beside them or whatever, and they've either been let to fall apart or they've got rodents and things appearing through the link detached. How much power have you got there, especially in one particular case where the residents are actually abroad?
Yes, and thank you for that. If I may, Chair, Councillor Jorgensen has added something to my list of things we could do more of if we had more resources, which I didn't think of at the time. So yeah, empty dwellings are a constant blight everywhere you go in the country, from urban boroughs to rural ones. What to do about empty dwellings, which in the case that you're using is where they're creating a nuisance for the neighbourhood. They're unsightly, maybe attracting vermin. So what powers do we have? We can do clear ups and remedy the site, and then charge the cost back to the owner of the property, which sounds like a great idea, but of course council might have to wait an awful long time to see any of its money back. So it does become a resources issue. We can put a charge on the property, of course, but it might be years before the property is sold and the council recovers its costs. So there is it's a policy decision when or how often to do that. There could be an enforced sale if there was arrears of council tax, which experience has shown is often the most effective way of getting the property sold and into the hands of somebody who's prepared to rectify it and live in it or sell it. Is arrears of council tax. That's if the owner, the absent abroad owner, has forgotten to regularise their council tax status. Some boroughs have punitive council tax rates for dwellings which are empty for more than a few months. I don't know whether this borough does or not. So those are the simplest ways of rectifying the problem. First one, we do the remedial works and then charge the costs as works in default to the owner of the property, put charge on the property. The second one is to try and do an enforced sale based on arrears of council tax. The powers which specifically exist for empty properties, if I can be forgiven for speaking bluntly, are hopeless. There's the Empty Dwelling Management Order, which was brought in the 2004 Housing Act, and hardly any councils in the country have ever successfully used an EDMO and lived to want to do it a second time. You basically incur all the cost, and if you do succeed in bringing the property up to a habitable standard, which of course would cost tens of thousands of pounds, and then successfully manage to rent it to somebody, probably somebody from the housing register, all the profit has to go to the owner. So why would you bother? So we'll move on from EDMOs hastily, and then you're into compulsory purchase territory, where you have to prove that the property is needed to fulfil a housing need. There is a common misconception that a council can compulsorily purchase an empty property just because it's empty. The law isn't written like that. CPO is what we know CPO to be. A council can CPO a property or a premises or a piece of land if it needs it. So it can CPO land because it needs to build on it or build a road. It can CPO an empty house because it needs the house to fulfil a housing need. If we have plenty of housing stock or the house is of the wrong type, then you wouldn't succeed in getting your CPO. And needless to say, it would take probably well over a year, probably nearer 2, to get the house compulsorily purchased. So the work involved is enormous because you're effectively confiscating somebody's valuable property. So sorry to be a bit gloomy, but those two powers I wouldn't recommend. So we're really in the more pragmatic area of prevention of damage by pests act. So you're clearing up the garden because it's attracting rats and mice, or an improvement notice because the property is causing a hazard for next door, or a drainage problem. There's often waterworks become decrepit, so we can do drainage type notices and do the remedial work and recover the costs.
Okay, anybody? Shirley?
Resulting from Rochelle's question about dog wardens. Do dog wardens have powers to make people put muzzles on their dogs, for example, if a dog has attacked other dogs? Do they have any powers in that regard?
Those are police powers under the Dangerous Dogs Act. think it was 1991 or something like that. That was the one where certain breeds of dogs were banned for domestic ownership, pit bull terriers, etc.
Yeah.
So if under the same act, the Dangerous Dogs Act, if a dog attacks a person, then there are remedial measures to do with that dog, which the police would have for seizure, which may involve the confiscation of the dog, but it could involve muzzling if it was a relatively minor issue, or indeed if the dog attacks an assistance dog. So assistance dogs are granted the same status as a human for the purposes of the Dangerous Dogs Act.
Yeah, that's interesting. The reason I asked was my daughter's dog got not in the borough, I hasten to add, but my daughter's dog got attacked by a big brute of a dog, and he had 6 broken ribs and a punctured lung. Was in doggy intensive care for 4 nights and so on. And it turned out that this dog had attacked 2 other dogs previously, and the police had failed to act because obviously it didn't attack a human or an assistance dog.
Yeah.
And it was referred to the dog warden, who basically did nothing. And I'm just interested to know whether they do have any powers to persuade people that their dog should be muzzled at the very least.
But our powers would be the same as the ones you've identified. So unfortunately, it is a common misconception in the public that if a dog attacks another dog or another animal, like a rabbit, or it will be considered a dangerous dog. But under the strict terms of the Act, it's a human or an assistance dog, except for another section, which is a dog dangerously out of control, which is a looser definition. So if a dog is dangerously out of control, then the owner could be committing an offence of allowing it to be dangerously out of control. So there is an offence against the owner, and they could be fined. But what you're actually asking is perhaps the more important bit about, can there be any restrictions put on the dog? I think there might be some conditions that can be put on the dog owner as a consequence of the conviction, I believe, from memory, under a dog dangerously out of control.
Okay, looks like we're done there. So I'd like to say thank you, Ed, for bearing with us and answering the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So moving on to the next agenda item, that's the preferred registered providers task and finish update. I believe that's to you, Shirley.
Is indeed, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, just to update members, that we spoke previously about setting up a task and finish group to look at the preferred registered housing providers, i.e. the housing associations that work in partnership with the council, ahead of their new contract being put out. What we basically were concerned about is that we have kind of parity across all of them, so that that when somebody reaches the top of the housing list and they get into a housing association property or a council property or any property, that they all are treated in the same way and get the same level of service. And I think that's where we're coming from with the group. And so we've had a couple of meetings now. The 1st of August, which was just agreeing the terms of reference, which I think have been circulated to everyone, have they, Chair? And then the second one, which was a very interesting meeting, where we had a man from Housemark who came along, and Housemark are the kind of body who kind of collect data from housing associations and councils, and he was a wealth of information about the varying levels of service that we get, and he actually alluded to the fact that some of the providers we have in the borough are not good providers, and he was talking about the legislation that is coming in, which is going to be much more stringent and give tenants a lot more power in. So tenant satisfaction surveys are going to be a much more prevalent thing, and so yeah, it was an interesting discussion, and I think it's focused us on where we want to go and who we want now to come forward to the next meetings, and we've got the next meeting coming up next Monday, and we were hoping to get somebody from Arch, which is the Association of Retained Council Housing. But at this point in time, we haven't managed to get anyone per se, but we have got Steve Bowers from Tenant and Landlord Improvement Panel, who is, he sits on Arch and goes to their meetings. So he's going to come along and talk to us, I think, about what Arch do. And I'm guessing to what we would maybe talk to him about is what we are doing well as a council, because that I think is important for us to establish what we're doing well. Are there things that we could be doing better? But so we can benchmark how we then proceed with these preferred providers. One of the slight concerns I had at the meeting, and Laura was at the meeting, so I don't know whether you thought the same, was that I felt that the officers felt that they'd already made a plan, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to the contract will go out, and we're already drafting everything. And I just felt that we might have to sort of say, well, hold on a moment here, don't go too far down that particular road, because we do obviously want to have some quite serious input into what the requirements are of those contracts. So I think we want to make sure that the task and finish group does have some impact on this process. Otherwise, there's no point in us doing it, really. So that I think is where we're at the moment. I don't know if Laura would like to add anything.
Just wanted to add that the plan is to come up with recommendations in 5 months' time, isn't it, for council? So that's the timescale for it.
Okay, any questions for Shirley and Laura? Michael?
Just, I mean, I'm not knocking it at all. It's actually fantastic, but I just wondered, apart from yourself and Laura, who are the other members of the group?
Members, yeah, we've Andy Croy, Chris Johnson, and Rebecca Margetts.
Sorry, Andy Croy, I think it's, sorry, the other one.
Yeah, Andy Croy, Chris Johnson,
Chris Johnson,
and Rebecca Margetts are the other members.
And then Laura as well.
And Laura as
yeah.
Well. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, the minutes, if this committee would like the minutes of our task and finish.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, sorry. I was just going to say, if you would like the minutes circulated of those task and finish group meetings, I think that would be helpful. And yeah, thank you. Can you organise that, Callum? Lovely, thank you.
Just one clarification. You mentioned that you thought officers rushing off to place contracts. What was that for? I just didn't quite catch that.
Some of them are quite big housing associations. So we've got Housing Solutions, who are one of the big ones. We've got Metropolitan Thames Valley, who are a huge one, and then Silver Homes, who were Bracknell Forest council houses, which then became a housing association. And we've got some of their homes, I guess, because there have been boundary changes at some point. So we've acquired some of their houses, historic houses, and then they've taken on new ones as well. So it's quite a complicated mixture. And one of the interesting things that we learned was actually, as well as these housing providers, there are also other housing associations who provide housing in our borough, who aren't on our registered preferred providers list. So we don't know much about those associations at all. So it would be interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is there's no up-to-date map showing in the borough of where these houses are and who owns what. So I've asked Frances Haywood if she could produce the most up-to-date information that she's got. So it would be really useful, I think, for all members actually, to, if they know of housing association properties in their wards, to let us know where they are. And if you've had tenants complaining about stuff, if you see these houses and they don't look particularly well looked after and so on and so forth, I think it would be useful to know about that.
Of related, I mean, I've got some housing association housing in my ward, and I've had tenants complaining about things like, and they're relatively new as well, things like damp, various other faults with the original build, plus a lot of antisocial behaviour and drug dealing and etc. etc. Are you going to pull any of the housing association people who've got a fair number of houses in to see what they think the service is like?
Yes, I think that's one of the things that we want to do, but we want to also we want to get people in from the housing associations. And they do have a regular meeting with Francis Haywood and Zulfikar and one or two other officers. They regularly meet, I think, once a quarter, but I think it would be useful to pull some in. But my thoughts were that perhaps it would be useful to get, first of all, to get some anecdotal information from as many sources as possible about certain housing associations and how they are performing. And as you say, those complaints are what I hear quite regularly from housing association tenants, is that they just get ignored. Then they complain and complain and complain, and repairs are not done properly. And a really interesting example of one was somebody whose immersion tank had developed quite a vigorous leak, and it took 8 weeks to actually just stop the thing leaking. And on one occasion, I had interceded with the housing association and said to them, look, I want somebody out tonight to drain this tank. The poor woman was living in fear that her ceiling was going to come down on her and her children because of this leak. And an operative turned up at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and he said, I've come to look at your tank. She said, well, I think you've come to drain the tank, haven't you? He said, oh, I don't know. He said, have you got a hose? And this is what she said, no, why would I have a hose? You've come to drain the tank. He said, well, I can't do it then. And off he went. That's the sort of thing that they're getting. They have these, obviously they get the cheapest tender in to do the repairs. And I guess the out of hours service is even more chaotic. So I think we do need to gather some evidence so we can challenge these the housing associations. And I think it is important that we have some idea of where they think they are, as you've said, because some of the ones I deal with say, oh, we're providing, if you look at their websites, and we provide a marvellous service. And that was actually one of the things that the contributor from Housemark said, was that at the moment, the way that they record data, so they're all doing it slightly differently. So the data can be skewed to make it look like they're performing much better than they actually are. So that's something we really need for them all to be recording complaints and service levels in the same way. I think that's a really important thing that we need to try and achieve with this project.
Is there any contractual obligation between them and the council?
The contract, did we circulate that? The agreement? I think not to the wider group, no. So I think it would be useful. Would you be interested in seeing the contract? Because it's not a very, I don't know much about contracts, to be honest. I've not ever had to draw any up, but when I read it, I thought this, to me, didn't seem to be very robust. So yeah, I think I sent it to you, didn't I, Callum? So yeah, if we could circulate that, if anyone's interested, just to get an idea of where we are at the moment.
David.
Just to confirm something, I think Laura said, but just in terms of the timeline for the project, when do you think actually it will be complete? And just to follow on, I think from Pauline's question, what does the output look like? Is this something that's actually going to be enforceable by contract, or is it a series of recommendations that we hope providers will aspire to, but haven't got any means of enforcing?
I think it will be a series of recommendations, and I think we need to possibly persuade them that it would be in their best interest to take them on board. I think the difficulty is that it's probably quite difficult for us to say, well, if you don't do it, then we won't use you, because they can just go off and deal with the developers direct. So I think the approach needs to be both tactful, but possibly built in with the fact that this is new legislation that's coming in, and they have got to all sharpen up their acts anyway. So and that we're on the back of that saying this is what we have a greater expectation. We've now had 5 years of experience of you being our preferred partners, and we kind of want everyone to up their game.
We've got a registered provider of our own, so we could actually, and we were talking about it, I think, we could actually be the provider of social housing for the developer as a council if we wanted to, I think.
We could do. We had Simon Price also speaking at the meeting, and I think that one of the problems is the cash in order to do that. Is to, you know, if you've got a development and you've got 30% of that development's going to be up for social housing, that the council hasn't necessarily got the resources to buy all that housing, and so we've used these I think we, as a council, we would prefer to use our own housing companies without a doubt.
You do get the rent, so
Yeah.
as long as you can get the money at a reasonable price, which you can for the Public Works Loan Board, the rent should actually provide enough funding. It'd be interesting to get somebody from maybe finance in the council to look at the business case for becoming more active as a registered provider and using the rent to fund the borrowing, because the borrowing is relatively cheap.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we could definitely get somebody from finance to come and talk us through that. Thank you, Pauline. Yeah, that's good.
A couple of questions. As ward members, we are going to hear about housing associations. So is it worthwhile asking all the ward members, can you please give us your feedback? And so give that in. That's the first question. Are you looking at property guardians? Yeah. Is there another way that people get housed, but they're not actually protected by any means? Okay.
It does depend what they are.
Yeah. Yeah, is that to do with anything to do with adult social care? Because that was a discussion.
No,
It's not.
it's not. No, it is actual tenants, people going to a building that's owned by a property guardian, and they have a lot less safety nets, so they could be ejected straight away. There's no. So I know there's sites within Wokingham and there are sites within Bracknell. Okay. The other one, maybe it's worth asking the providers what their staff turnover is. I know with my dealing with one provider, their staff turnover has been fantastic. So you never get to follow the same person, then you've got to reiterate the same case, So that's just a point.
Yeah. Well, actually, the gentleman from Housemark, he was he was really interesting because he was saying that one of the big problems in these housing associations is they have a really big turnover of staff. And they've cut costs and they've cut staff to the bone. So, you know, when tenants are phoning up because they've got a complaint, they can be on the phone for sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, you know, this kind of thing, before they actually get through to anybody, because they really have pared down their staff, and they have such high turnover. So staff aren't well trained in a lot of cases as well.
I think, Shelley, just to add, because I know Pauline mentioned about antisocial behaviour, he specifically mentioned that a lot of housing associations have reduced their specialist teams, for example, antisocial behaviour teams. Again, as Shelley said, reduce them right down to basically the minimum that they can possibly provide, which is obviously then going to create more issues down the line.
I think all of these are questions that we would definitely want to put to all the providers, and to find out, you know, how many staff they have, how many cases that they deal with, how they deal with complaints. I think is quite interesting. I was put through a complaint on behalf of a resident not so long ago, and they very, very quickly came back with a sort of yes, well, we've dealt with that, and we've made this offer, and it was a terrible offer, and they had of compensation, and they had listed only about half of the calls that the resident had to make to them, and she luckily had got text records of all the calls. So, you know, and I went back to them and I said, sorry, I'd like to escalate this to a stage 2 complaint. And 2 days later, I got just got an email back saying, yes, we've looked at your stage 2 complaint and there's nothing, you know, we've investigated it and there's an end to it. There was no further communication was allowed. And it was like, how can you decide in 2 days that this complaint is now finished with? So they are quite difficult people to deal with, it seems. And I kind of hope that some of them are good. You know, I'd like to think that some of them are actually doing a good job, but as yet I've not come across one that seems to be doing a particularly good job for their tenants.
So one more point in terms of looking at the housing associations, because we've got the large developments going on and they have the allocation of the housing, is for the housing associations to be aware of any covenants on the properties and to ensure that they, as a housing association, are aware and adhere to them. So, for example, making sure the outside of the properties are maintained properly, gardening is maintained, rubbish areas are kept clean and tidy, parking is facilitated. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that they are legally responsible for, but don't seem to be aware of. I'm dealing with a case like that right now. So what covenants? Well, these. Yep. Okay, do we have any other questions? No? Okay, thank you, Shirley. So the next item is the work programme coming up. So any questions or comments on that, Laura?
Just touching on what was discussed earlier, I think if there are any reports coming where the exec member can't attend, I think just as you as chair, just decide if we can bump it to another month, just to make sure we've got everyone we need.
Yep, that's a good and valid point, and I've noted it down. With respect to the work programme, I know on the 19th we've got the fraud action plan. Unfortunately, the officer concerned hasn't actually got the time to write a report. So what he's going to do is come along with a quick presentation about what they do, some case studies, and give some examples of fraud, as opposed to giving us a written report, simply because he's got a lot of work on. So just to let you all know that. The other one we do have coming up is the local plan update. So I just want to see what expectations we have from the officer coming to us to speak about that. So I just want to make sure we give the officer a good steer. As it stands, I have asked for the current position of where we are, what the timescales are of the local plan, what challenges we're being faced, how they're going to deal with the over delivery that we've done in the past. So are there any other questions from this committee that we'd like to give the officer a steer on so that we get sort of the information there before on the night? So, yeah, Pauline.
I'm not sure if it's within the remit of that officer, but we could ask them how they're going to deal with the legal appeals that seem to be going on at the moment, because we haven't got a local plan, and whether we've got any protection that they can suggest, and whether there's anything they should do in an interim measure before they get their act together and get this thing out that could protect us.
That's a good question. Yeah. Anybody else? David?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there's two meetings taking place, one on that day and then one on the following day with the working group working on the local plan. So I'm wondering actually what we are going to learn from this item that's be of real value to us, because there's so much, it seems to be occurring right in the middle of a lot of other activity. And I can imagine that we're going to get an update on the timeline, but we get that on a bit of paper without having to sit here for an hour and a half. The thing that I suspect we're all interested in is how they're getting on in resolving the various conflicts about the particular sites and the allocations. I'm a little sceptical that we're going to get too much information on the 19th to inform us about that. So I'm kind of almost, I was going to ask the question the other way around and say, what do you think we can expect to hear from Ian on that day?
Which is kind of what I suggested on that piece of paper I've got here, which is the current position, supply, timeline, challenges, how we're dealing with the over delivery. We've got Pauline's question there, which I think is actually a very pertinent one with some of the appeals that are going through. So I do think there is value for us to understand where everything is going, if only just as a report out, but we still have to ask some questions. If those questions are then asked, then you've got the subsequent meeting, you can then sort of niggle down into those questions, saying that the overview and scrutiny asked these questions, we need to deal with them. Anybody else?
Another thing, we could actually ask him what the progress is on the lobbying that was promised. So there was quite a ballsy claim that we were going to lobby the government and we were going to get a different policy. So an update on what's happened there would be useful.
Yep. Okay. That's right. I do believe that's the end.
Shall I just quickly jump in on the work?
Yes,
Very
yep.
quickly. Just with the MTFP, members will notice I did send around an email about the another additional meeting on the 26th. The reason we're doing this is because Graham Ebers, so the Director of Finance, he wants to split up the meeting so you have one directorate per meeting, because last year we had, or we tried to do, I believe, Place and Growth and what used to be Communities, Insight and Change on one night, and it took longer than we had to defer one of them. So I think splitting it into their component parts, hopefully members will find that useful, and you can sort of focus on specific areas, for example, highways, and then, you know, finance and business services and things like that. The only other thing I just quickly wanted to mention is perhaps thinking about that, looking at the meeting on the 29th, it's looking quite busy, and I just wondered if members would be willing to move the arts and culture strategy to the meeting in December, just so that you can have a proper, because those are two big items, the LC WIP and the medium-term financial plan. I just wondered if, as long as that's acceptable, I can go to officers and hopefully that'll be fine for them as well.
For me. Yep. Yep. Looks like you've got nods from the table. Yep. Thank you. Okay. Shirley.
Thank you. I was wondering, I'm a bit concerned. I don't know if members saw the article in The Guardian earlier in the week, and also a TV. Pardon?
It wasn't in the Telegraph.
Sorry. Well, you should have read this because it was about Wokingham and it was about the pressure that Citizens Advice are under in Wokingham, providing help for our residents. And it was quite an interesting article. And since then, Jake Morrison has also been on one of the local TV stations and talking about the pressure that they're under. And I am very, very concerned that this is a bit of a cry for help from Citizens Advice and that they are really, really struggling already. And with the way things are going, if something isn't done about energy prices and generally helping the poorer, particularly the poorer, but even quite a lot of other people, I think that they could go under, and this was going to really jeopardise our anti-poverty strategy and helping people. So I just wondered whether, and I don't know whether this is the right the group to bring this to, but whether there ought to be some kind of scrutiny of the process now before it reaches real crisis point. And I'm not saying that Citizens Advice are not doing a good job, but I think that possibly a lot of the people who are volunteers, particularly in Citizens Advice, are getting a lot more than they signed up for. And are, the pressure that they are under because of these huge percentages and increases in people who are requiring their assistance. And I think we just need to perhaps be on top of that. So I mentioned it to Callum earlier on because I wasn't quite sure which overview and scrutiny committee it ought to be seen by, but I do wonder whether we could try and slot that in somewhere because I think that's very pressing.
To me, it does sound useful for our scrutiny committee to look at it time-wise and actually officer time. And actually, because if Jake and his team are really busy, then having to come along to talk to us is going to be hard. But if he's willing to do that, I don't see an issue. Actually, Laura.
In the past, the Poverty Strategy and the Hardship Alliance have gone to talk to the ONS Management Committee, and as I understand, it was programmed in their work stream, so maybe worth chatting to their chair just to see what they're planning and to make sure what Shirley's proposed is picked up for them, just to make sure one of the ONS committees sees it.
Good idea.
If it does come here and timings work, it could potentially come on that extraordinary meeting on the 26th of October. Potentially, but I'll liaise with Peter and you can speak to management.
Yep.
I think it's a good topic. Maybe to try and reduce the effort for Jake, could we do it the other way around and ask the officers here to explain how they support Citizens Advice and get them to write it up, and then ask Jake to identify how effective it is and what gaps there are? Because then he won't have to do a lot of work. He will just pick up what we do and say, yeah, that's good, that's not, and this is what else I need. That'd be sensible.
That sounds like a good idea because we don't want to increase Jake's workload by any stretch of the imagination, but it would be very useful for us all, I think, to understand how that partnership works and what our expectation is of them and what they should be expecting from us. Because obviously during COVID the partnership was brilliant, but that was a different circumstance. And also there were a lot of council officers who were available to pitch in and do things. There were lots of officers who weren't doing their normal roles and they were able to pitch in and help with Citizens Advice. And now we've got this situation where, it's escalating and they haven't got all that support that they had back in the COVID period. So it's a huge worry.
So I think start with what we think we do and then let him fill the gaps in rather than the other way around. The other thing to remember is there's Reading as well as Wokingham, because some of the Reading Citizens Advice, I think, provide services to some areas. Do they not anymore? They used to in early.
No, they're only going to, everyone's being directed to Wokingham Citizens Advice, but there are a couple of organisations in Reading who don't get any funding from the council, but they also see some of our residents, quite a lot of our residents who end up, particularly residents from my ward, who are obviously much closer to Reading. And that's Reading Welfare Rights and an organisation called Communicare, who they're also seeing a lot of our residents, but not getting any funding at the present moment. So they're obviously would like to get funding, And if you know, citizens' advice aren't managing to cope with what the workload they've got, then we possibly may have to bring in other organisations from outside. I don't know, but I think we need to find out whether we're doing enough to support citizens' advice and whether. you know,
Okay, we'll take,
where we go from there.
take that on board.
Yeah.
Carol, you want to say?
I was just going to query whether, because I know we obviously have the voluntary sector hub now. I wondered if you wanted officers to sort of, as well as providing a more in-depth commentary on citizens' advice, whether there is of a more, I have no idea, but whether there is a more general issue perhaps with other organisations as well in terms of their workload and what we're expecting of them and sort of the service they're delivering. So I wondered if I could ask officers to sort of provide a general view of how we work with our voluntary sector colleagues, but then also a specific interest in citizens' advice Wokingham.
Laura?
Thank you. I'd agree with you, Callum. I think the Hardship Alliance would be able to give you a lot of honesty about what they're seeing, because they're a collective of charities that have been working with the council, and obviously they have strong links with the large voluntary hub as well, which you know well, Shirley. So I think that's a good place to start, to make sure it's not the whole onus is on citizens' advice, it's on a spread.
Okay, sounds like we've got some options there. Okay, looks like we're done then with the agenda. So thank you for your time and good evening.